In our last lecture, we are going to look at von Thunen's model, and we are additionally going to be looking at problems in agriculture. Von Thunen's model was created by Johann Heinrich von Thunen, which was a German farmer, and he actually is going to create a theory that we can still use in some limited fashion today, called the isolated state. And his idea was that if, hypothetically speaking, anything could be grown anywhere, so we're not taking into consideration climate, we're not looking at topography or soil type or anything like that. If hypothetically anything could be grown or raised anywhere, why do certain crops end up being, or certain types of livestock end up being located where they are? And what he says is the proximity to the market is the most important thing when deciding what choice of crop or livestock to specialize in for commercial farms. So here's quickly von Thunen, looking rather judgmental, if I must say. Von Thunen's model is going to compare two costs. So when deciding what to farm and where to farm it, you have to consider the cost of the land versus the cost of transporting a product to the market. So we're going to actually look at this using quickly a sketch, because the first cost that we're going to be looking at is the cost of the land. In order to look at the cost of the land, we're going to be using something called the bid rent model. The bid rent model is going to have an X and Y axis, and where those X and Y axes actually meet is going to be called our market. Okay, the market is going to be where you sell your food. This is also a synonym for, of course, where your city is located. So von Thunen actually uses this bid rent model. All right, so the bid rent model is going to be an assessment of cost of land. So here we're actually looking at the distance away from the city. This axis is going to be looking at the price of the land, and typically this is going to be per acre. Okay, in von Thunen's theory, he uses hectare. So von Thunen would say a farmer has to consider where in relation to the market, where in relation to this area, should you farm depending on how much land you need. So let's talk livestock ranching really quickly. Livestock ranching needs an awful lot of land. So in order for you to properly decide where to live, you are going to be bidding on a piece of land. Well, livestock ranching needs a whole lot of land. So how much are you willing to pay per acre? Probably a very, very, very low price. So if you bid on land, we'll say close to the downtown city area, say around the Kansas City River Market area or the Kansas City Power and Light area, it's likely that the cost that you are willing to pay for land, because you need a ton of it, is going to be really, really low. At the same time, you are going to get outbid by other types of land use. So, for example, entertainment districts, posh little restaurants, hotels, that type of stuff are actually going to outbid you. So there's no way you're going to be able to own land in this area for that type of farming. So usually when we're looking at the bid rent suggests that the further away you are from the city center, typically the less expensive the land is going to be. So if we were to chart that, out here you're going to have a very, very low cost of land. As you get closer to the city center, so we'll say right here, okay, the price of that land is going to go up. As you get closer, it's going to get even higher. And as you get closest, okay, it's probably going to be, again, the highest cost. So in this case, okay, here, most people down towards the city center are going to have very small plots of land. They're not going to have really, really big, vast areas. That's also why we have things like airports, usually way out away from the city, where it's going to take up a lot of land. So when we're talking about farmers, and we'll use von Thunen for example, farming needs to consider this price of the land. So if you need an awful lot of land, you probably are going to want to be located in the furthest ring away from the city. So this ring out here, so hypothetically, we would have a great big circle all the way around the city. And, okay, this would actually be where your livestock ranching is going to occur. And that's because you need a lot of land. Okay, it's pastoral, so you're going to be moving from pasture to pasture. So everything out here is going to be ranching. You also don't need especially close to the market, because again, it's not something that's going to perish And so ranching could be really, really far away. The next ring, it would probably be some sort of crop farming. So crop farming, you're going to need less land than ranching, but at the same time, you're still using a lot more land than maybe, okay, you want to pay really high prices down here. So crop farming would be somewhere around here. You also might have like another little ring where we actually have crop farming, but this crop farming will not use fallow. So this one would be no fallow, and this one would probably use fallow. The one on the outside, fallowing, makes sense because you don't necessarily have to use that land super intensively because it's cheaper. If you're going to buy land that's more expensive, you're not going to let it just sit there not making anything for you. So the next ring is going to actually be timber. So timber today really doesn't make sense, but in von Thunen's time period, timber was super important, and all cities had a ring around the city center of timber. So timber, of course, wooded area for the purpose of cutting it down, and then you would actually sell it to the city center for heat sources, fuel sources as well, cooking, that type of thing. But the reason that you would do this, first of all, you do need a lot of land, so you don't want to be too close. But at the same time, the timber is really, really, really expensive. It's very heavy to transport. You don't want to be too far away. So timber was right there in that ring. And then the last ring, and the one that's going to be closest to the city, is going to have dairy and then also market gardening. So market gardening is going to be things like your fresh produce, things that's going to wilt and not look very pretty if you are too far away. Dairy, for example, would perish if it was too far away. So all of these rings are actually von Thunen's model. However, this X and Y axis with the cost of the land is what we call the bid rent model. It's also worth mentioning that the bid rent model can change, let's say if we add another city area. So as we move towards St. Louis, you might see actually that the cost of land will start to go back up. So as you move closer to the area of their downtown area, you'll see that actually maybe the price will go up. If that's the case, then you are livestock ranching, then you may actually want to put your livestock ranching somewhere out here between these areas where it's going to be the cheapest. And then actually you would start to see these rings start to develop again around this new city area. All right, so when we're talking about von Thunen's model, again, dairy farming is going to be in the closest ring to the city center. Timber is going to be in the second closest ring because of its weight and difficulty of transportation. Cattle farming is probably going to be as far out as possible because you're going to need a great deal of pasture. And fruits and vegetables, think market gardening, is going to be really, really close to the city center because of perishability, much like dairy. So in an isolated state, this actually is a really good example. You can actually see the rings. And it gives you the idea also of crop farming with fallow, crop farming without fallow, and livestock farming being on the far end. In an isolated state, this is what it would look like if we actually had modified conditions. So for example, if we had like a little suburb out there, or we have a river, this would actually change these rings and they would not look exactly like they do. And instead would actually be modified because of improvements of transportation. So today, if we're talking about contemporary model land use, this is the bid rent model. As you get closer to the city, of course, rent goes up. Today, what we need to talk about is, okay, how does this differ? So instead of market gardening and milk production being really, really close, most dairies today can be much further away. So because of that, the dairies are going to be beyond the city center area because of pasteurization and improved trucking, refrigerated trucking, that type of thing. We would say as far out as the milk shed being about 300 miles now. Timber is no longer going to be close to the market, and that's actually because of need. We don't use timber now for daily heating of our homes or daily cooking, and so therefore timber, when it is used, it's usually for lumber or something like that. So timber can be super duper far away. Again, it's not perishable, and you want a vast amount of land, and so you want the cheapest possible. Von Thunen's model, you can still see how it works in some situations. So like crop farming, livestock farming, that type of stuff, you can still see that. You can also actually see the influence still on the American landscape. A lot of dairy farms are still located close to the eastern seaboard, and that's because the markets were there. A lot of the dairy farms, of course, in Wisconsin, things like that, are going to specialize in cheese and butter and things that don't perish. So it's not a perfect example anymore, but the theory still stands, and it's one that we need to discuss. You can see it across the landscape. All right, other things that we need to talk about are problems in agriculture. When we talk about problems in agriculture, one of the biggest problems is famine, which is acute starvation associated with a sharp increase in mortality. So, unfortunately, the death rate spiking. Undernourishment or undernutrition is something that our country deals with, and it's not necessarily because of famine, but it's because of a lack of proper nutrients, a lack of proper nutrition. We are eating things, but the things that we are eating are not actually nutritious. Areas where there's a great deal of undernourishment is actually food deserts. Food deserts typically exist in low-income areas, really rural areas, and additionally Native American reservations. If you look at the map up here, where there's no car and no supermarket store within a mile, largely urban areas, also really rural areas, these are food deserts. These exist when nutritious food is difficult to obtain because either you can't access them by car, you have to take multiple bus routes, for example. It could be that you can't actually afford them, distance, or that there's limited places to shop in a given area. A good example of this is east of Truce. East of Truce for a long time did not have a supermarket because no supermarket thought that it was going to be profitable to put anything there. Because of this area that's already low income really relied upon going to the corner store like the Sinclair gas station or going to a fast food place to eat every single meal. And unfortunately, we know diet is a lot of times linked to health. And these are the same people that can't afford preventative health care. And so when it becomes a major problem, they have major health problems. A lot of times these are people that don't have health insurance. And so it's just this really ugly perpetual cycle that we need to work on. So food deserts are things that need to be addressed. In Kansas City, they just opened an Aldi east of Truce a couple of years ago with the purpose of addressing food deserts and trying to get nutritious food accessible to people who ordinarily did not have access before. You also have the problem of overproduction, which sounds silly because too much food doesn't really sound like a problem. But if there is too much food supplied, then that actually causes the prices to plummet. And if the prices plummet, farmers aren't able to pay back their loans, and that becomes a major problem. Other problems in agriculture actually are government subsidies can sometimes cause problems. They're meant to help farmers and they're meant to address national level agricultural crises. So, for example, the whole goal of a farm subsidy is to maintain the profitability of farming, to make sure that farmers don't go out of business. Because if you have one bad year and you can't pay back your loans and you go out of business, then that means that farmer's not farming the next year. If the next year there's a shortage of food and that farmer is an additional to the shortage not farming, you have even less food, which means the cost of food is going to go up. So the United States government is going to actually try to encourage farmers to not grow certain crops. So for example, if this year we believe there's already going to be too much corn on the market, then they will actually pay you to not farm corn in order to keep market prices high for corn. They also might buy up the surplus and guarantee a fixed price for it. So if two people show up with oodles of soybeans, like tons and tons of soybeans this year, the market price is going to drop dramatically. So what the government will do is actually buy up the extra, the surplus, give the farmers a fair market price, but hold off some of those soybeans so that the market price will remain high. A lot of times they'll then turn around and they'll actually sell that to a less developed country or even drop it off. Food stamp programs, things like that as well. The problem that's created is that instead of discouraging production of crops that are expected to be in excess, they know that there's already going to be a fixed price for surplus. So therefore, why not just keep farming what you normally do? You don't have to learn a new trade. You don't have to use new machinery. And you know that the government, if we show up and there's tons and tons of crops, the government's going to buy it off of you anyways. The government also has to redistribute the surplus. And usually, like I said, they will look to international governments to do this. This, though, is going to undermine the price structure of other countries. So, for example, if there's a surplus of soybeans and we go dump our soybeans in, say, I don't know, Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe farmers just took out loans to sell soybeans, that unfortunately is going to drop the price of soybeans for those farmers, and therefore they may not actually have any incentive to continue farming. The following year, if we don't have a surplus of soybeans, then the price is going to go down, or price will go up rather, and there won't be actually any there because the Zimbabwean farmers will probably have given it up. Other problems are cycle of poison, which has been brought to the public attention. We talked about this in class with DDT being on the landscape and being a carcinogen. Loss of topsoil is another problem, and desertification, which is semi-arid land degradation. This is from overgrazing and overfarming. We call this, actually relates to the tragedy of the commons, and it looks like I'm going to have to make another video, which sucks because it's probably going to be like 3 minutes long. But I really want to make sure that we go over the tragedy of commons. So stay tuned and click on the next video to wrap this up.